This is Terry Smith on my left, Rick Leason, Ron Fox, and Tom Wolfe. Fluid Systems brought down a unit and parked it beside the hotel, tossed a hose into Sarasota Bay. You remember that?
Well, I remember that was at a time when people couldn't visualize what RO is.
Right.
Now pretty much everyone knows because they can relate to it through Aquafina or something like that. It touches people, or they have an under sink unit.
Right.
25, 30 years ago when we were talking about it, no one knew what it was. It was membrane, and they assumed it was biological, some animal skins that were being used to. So, I think that was a lot of that type of thing, is having demonstrations where people could see, in a tangible way.
Right.
What could be done.
Well, even the applications weren't developed, and so we were continually doing pilot studies with some really nasty stuff that most of them never went anywhere, but some of them were successful and went on to applications that were commercialized later.
Yeah. Speaking about nanomembranes, or nanotechnology modified membranes.
Okay.
What do you think is the future of those types of devices compared to what we would refer to as a conventional RO membrane?
Well, I mean, the one nano H2O, of course, is almost a conventional membrane with modified parts dispersed through it. The carbon nanotube ones, a lot of promise. The only ones that seem to actually be working right now are the ones where they built the carbon nanotubes in situ so they're not blocked. Those are very, very expensive to do, and there is an intrinsic, even though you can measure the passage through the tube, there's a hydraulic loss going through these little tubes. They're tiny, they're 1 nanometer or less in diameter, and that's a few molecules of water going through. And so the question is, how can you support these things in a way to get them thin enough so that, so I think we're coming to where we have a physical
limitation.
A physical limitation of how to support these things. And then, of course, the ultimate of this is the graphene nanotube, which I don't know if you've seen this. This is the latest from MIT. You have a piece of graphene, which is a layer of graphite, one molecule of graphite thick, so one ring. And you punch holes in this with an electron beam. Once again, at that 1 nanometer, 10 angstroms, 1 nanometer, or slightly less is kind of the optimum size water fits through, ions won't. And now you have a very, very short passage, but the question is, how do you support this? And if you could figure out a way to cast this graphene, for example, on the top of a polysulfone support that'll give it some flexibility, I think that you would see a big improvement there, because that you're going to lose a lot of losses. And if you can keep them uniform, then you're not going to get much back diffusion of the salts like we have in the conventional membranes.
Right.
One of the things that you have to keep, anything that's dealing with water on a big scale, you got to keep it clean.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of things that sort of work in laboratory environments that are fundamentally sound. I mean, I remember being kind of excited by diffusion systems, per evaporation system. Remember, Gore had membrane, and they came out with it, and they had a lot of research, and they were intelligent people. They completely abandoned it because basically they could never keep the surface clean.
Yep, well, personally, the membrane I'd like to see is the forward osmosis membrane. I mean, think about this. Every coastal sewage treatment plant could have a power recovery system sitting there on the sewage. It's going to mix with the ocean water anyway. You don't have to worry about, NSF type approval. It says no one's going to drink the water. You're just going to put the electricity into the system, and they can be small, big, however. And this is, this is pretty interesting stuff.
What about large format membranes? We've talked a lot about, I've talked to some of the other people about Fluid Systems' entree into that market for the Yuma project. FilmTech at one time was talking about a replacement for a DuPont bundle, which was like 11 inches or something, 10 and a half inches or something like that.
They actually had 11 and a half, and they sold 2 small systems in the late
And
80s.
now-
And then now the
Now we're
industry is
talking about-
standardized on a 16-inch.
Yeah, except for Coke.
Well, Coke
I think they've given
is
up.
probably given up. I'm not entirely sure that's correct, but
Yeah.
I would surmise that they have. And everybody's waiting for Sarek, which is an Israeli project to
Right.
start up, the largest one in the world at the moment. And that's vertical, 16-inch
Right.
vertical, which is, has another bunch of challenges. But you may see large 16-inch plants more commonly after that one starts up, is successful.
I think, to me, one of the visionary people in terms of what could be done with large scale was the Bureau of Reclamation when they designed Yuma in the 70s. These guys were people that are big civil engineering type people, and they laid out their plant, even though a lot of it was 8-inch and they had the 12 and they laid their plant out completely differently than conventional
It was actually
thinking.
eight
So-
and a half. The Hydronautics part was 8.5.
But, their concept there was that everything in a rack was in parallel.
Yeah.
And they arrayed their racks. They didn't try to do arraying and piping
Right.
within a rack. And so
Right.
when you start thinking, and again, this was like 30 years ago, and all the RO experts were aghast by this. But I think that's exactly the way that the large diameter things are going to come out, and I think that's a lot.
I think large plants will come out that way too.
Yeah, exactly. And
Large
so
plants.
as you get to these plants that are truly massive, then they're going to be moving, driven for those.
There's one other component we haven't mentioned in much depth is the pre-treatment and the knowledge to run one of these plants successfully. And that knowledge has gotten better and better every year. The problem with, if you were running 16-inch 10, 15 years ago, you'd be in and out of the vessel changing membranes all the time. And today, you don't do that nearly as much as you used to because you've got your pre-treatment running properly.
Right.
So you can put a 16-inch in, and it will live its whole life maybe in that vessel, and then you'll take it out. So you don't have to get in and out.
That's
Like-
kind of what I
like
was
we
saying
did.
about you got to keep it clean.
Having been involved in this industry, and some took some time off to play on sailboats and stuff like that. But would you do it again?
Sailing? Yes, of course.
And more.
Actually, the membrane industry has been very good to me over the years. I can't complain. And would he do it again? I don't think any of us consciously chose to go into the water business. Not one of us. It was one
I
of the
did.
things you fell into, and
But then I'm British.
but then it wasn't bad. So yeah, I'd do it again.
Ron?
Yeah, but very differently. Yeah, make a few
Truly.
changes.
Yeah. Rick?
Yeah, I think I would because I don't know any different. I mean, it's been just like Tom. It's been a good. I've seen the world and made a living at it, but at the same time, if I had a chance to join Google
Yeah,
or
actually,
something
I remember,
like that,
I remember running into you in Raffles in Singapore one night, many years
Okay,
ago.
well, and I saw Tom in South Africa when
Yeah.
he was down there, and then we've all really had a chance to see the world in
Yeah,
a way
that's right.
kind of surprising,
That's
for
right.
the average
That's right.
engineer. And I interject one name that I
Yes.
suddenly thought of as almost a secondary thought, but Al Riedinger, I mean, apparently he's passed on, so I know he's not part of these interviews and stuff, but I think all of us were, when we were young, we used to kind of tease him a little bit because he was a kind of a curmudgeon-y guy and everything. But looking back in my life, I realized that I learned a lot from that guy.
Yeah.
and,
He's a smart
and
guy. Yeah.
Yes.
he was a chemical engineer, I think, from Caltech or whatever, and he was really the first person, the first on the spot with the spiral element, this kind of configuration, and did a lot of the original pioneering work on how to model this thing. And now people have improved. Tom has become an expert on it and all, but when you really think back, here was a guy on day one, and he's just a name that doesn't get mentioned too much.
Right.